on where you are in the country today. I'm glad that you've opted to join us to hear some of the most recent examples or new findings on how the data that's being curated and submitted through Nature's Notebook is being used. And so today what we're going to do is go through quite a few different examples. I thought first I'd share with you some of the management examples, so some of the more applied ways in which the data are being used by different groups in different parts of the country. And then we also have a couple of examples from the research community where folks have been downloading the data from the website and using it for scientific discovery. So I'll do my best to try and convey that as well. But before we launch into that, I would love to know a little bit more about you. And so I have a poll question here that Erin's about to launch where I would love to know what best describes you. And I believe that this question is one where you can click as many as are appropriate for your situation. But you can specify whether you are currently a participant in Nature's Notebook, whether you are what we call a local phenology leader, which is somebody who helps coordinate a group of individuals in collecting data through Nature's Notebook. So this often occurs either at things like parks or nature centers or through Master Gardener chapters. We have hundreds of these now. Whether you're a researcher who might use the data or is using the data or is thinking about using the data, whether you're a natural resource manager who may or may not use Nature's Notebook, or someone just kind of looking to learn more. And how are we doing on the poll?
All right, looks like about half of people have voted, so we'll give you a few more seconds. All right, looks like most people have voted. So I'm not able to show the results on the screen, but we have about 75% of the people on the call are Nature's Notebook observers, 27% are local phenology leaders, 27% are researchers, 18% are natural resource managers, and 64% are looking to learn more about phenology.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for sharing that, and thank you, Erin, for summarizing it. Hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions today. So I thought that I would first share that we've got, of course, really great news to report that people are continuing to participate in Nature's Notebook and the data are continuing to roll in, making it possible for researchers and scientists and natural resource managers to use this phenology data and information. So far in the calendar year 2015, we've got close to 1,500 active participants that have submitted data so far in this year from across the country. And since Nature's Notebook launched in 2009, we are now at about 5,500 individuals that have submitted data at one point or another in the program. And those data are coming in from about 7,300 sites across the US now, which is really coming together to make a pretty decent, solid data set that's becoming more and more appropriate and sufficient for answering the kinds of questions that are bubbling up out there. So the first thing we're going to do is focus on some of the more applied decision-making kind of questions. How are decision makers, natural resource managers, and others using these phenology data that we've got here housed at the USA-NPN? And the first example that I'm going to describe hails out of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And there's a group of folks, very active folks, based out of University of Minnesota there that have organized with other citizen scientists in the region to create this Minnesota Phenology Network to answer a variety of questions. But one of the big ones that they're really focused on is trying to get a better handle on when are leaves falling off of deciduous trees in the neighborhoods surrounding, within the city and in the surrounding suburbs. The reason why they care about this is that after leaves fall off the trees, then they tend to accumulate underneath the trees in the sidewalks and streets, and then are washed down into storm drains, which then lead into waterways. And these surface waters, when they are faced with big pulses of nutrients that are coming out of rotting leaves, can lead to major eutrophication problems. And they've got some inland waterways that have been suffering pretty drastically from this eutrophication, which leads to big algae blooms and bad smells and poor water quality. And so what they've recognized is that if they can time these street sweepers, which are put out there by the Department of Public Works, to be well timed with when the leaves are falling off the trees, then they can keep those leaves out of the storm drains and therefore out of the waterways, leading to higher increased water quality. And so for the last couple of years, the Minnesota Phenology Network has been advertising to local citizens in the area to collect data on when leaves are dropping off of their neighborhood trees using Nature's Notebook. And this graph that I'm showing now is a screen capture from a poster that was presented at the Ecological Society of America meeting last year from 2014, which showed the day of year, or the time when neighborhood citizens in the Twin Cities area documented the different species of leaves falling off. And you'll see that what they learned was that in this particular year anyway, many of the trees were dropping their leaves at about the same time. They've got this one, Quercus palustris, which is an oak, that extended way later in the year. However, the Department of Public Works is constrained regarding when they can put their street sweepers out on the ground, and so they were able to time it to do a pretty good job at picking up those leaves. And so this was just kind of a pilot project in 2014, but they are continuing to expand this program, and they have plans to try and team up with watershed managers in the area to do an even better job at documenting how when timing the street sweepers better can lead to increased water quality. And so if you're interested in learning even more about this particular example, we did cover it briefly, in brief form, in our 2014 annual report too, which you may have seen. And if not, the cover is there on the left side of the screen, and then that description of that story and how the Minnesota Phenology Network is collecting that leaf fall data is documented on page 7. And you can access this from our website.
And we had a comment from one of the participants, Carrie, who said, yes, this happened in DC too. My oak didn't lose its leaves until after the last street sweeping.
Oh, darn those oaks. Good to know. It would be really fascinating if anybody out there is listening to dig into our database and see if that's a phenomenon that's pervasive across oaks and across the country, because I don't really know that. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, I thought I'd walk you through an example that is local here. In case you're not aware, the National Coordinating Office of the USA National Phenology Network is here in Tucson, Arizona. We're co-located at the University of Arizona, where we have a major problem with an invasive grass called Buffelgrass. This is a grass that was introduced from Africa back in the approximately 1930s, because we thought it would be a good thing to feed the invasive cattle, or the non-native cattle that we brought over here. The cattle don't love it. They will eat it. However, it has become a major problem because it does a really good job at creating a whole lot of seeds and spreading itself into the Sonoran Desert. This is a picture of generally what our landscapes tend to look like, where you can see that it's very complex topography, and the plants are generally spaced pretty far apart with a lot of bare ground in a natural setting, a lot of bare ground in between the plants. What Buffelgrass does is fill in all of those spaces in between the cacti and the woody plants that tend to grow native here, and it creates basically a continuous mat of biomass that dries out and then becomes a very, very serious problem for fuels for fires, which are quite common this time of year when we start having very high temperatures, very dry conditions, and then we start to have lightning in monsoon storms that are coming up. And what this can lead to is very hot fires, which are very problematic in a system that's not fire adapted. And it can lead to just the decimation of all living things on the ground. And even things like, I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but this is a cactus that's burning. And our ecosystems here are not fire adapted. Cacti absolutely cannot tolerate fire. They explode and die. And it's really problematic because our iconic saguaro cacti takes decades to get large, like sometimes 50 to 100 years before they're the real big iconic ones with the arms. And so researchers are trying to figure out, and land managers are trying hard to deal with this problem and figure out the best way to handle it. One of the very common ways to treat bufflegrass is to hand pull it, but as you can guess from this kind of topography, that it's pretty inefficient and pretty time-consuming and labor intensive. And so another way that's been discovered that is fairly effective for treating it is to use herbicide. Just broad-spectrum herbicide like Roundup works pretty well. However, if you know anything about a broad-spectrum herbicide, that means that it'll kill everything that it hits that's green. And so it's ideal to try and identify when is there a window when the bufflegrass is green, the other non-target species are not green, and ideally too, you want to hit the bufflegrass before it's gone to seed, because otherwise killing the plant after it's dispersed its seeds doesn't really gain you anything. This plant makes prolific seeds that are very good at germinating in the following year. And so researchers locally here have been trying to figure out, can we identify any such window to help guide herbicide spraying, and can we link up that information that we collect on the ground with anything else, say like climatological conditions or data that we could collect from satellites that might make it even more efficient for us to be able to time those treatment windows. And so researchers here with the U.S. Geological Survey hooked up with the National Coordinating Office here to encourage volunteers from the region to monitor bufflegrass and figure out when it's green, when it's got seeds on it, and so on. And so I think this is a kind of dated map, because I think we have more observation sites than this, but I grabbed this from our website. And for a couple of years now, we've had observers out there tracking bufflegrass to better understand its phenological cycles throughout the year. And what observers have reported is that there are distinct pattern cycles to the green up and the green down in the plants over the course of the year. And you can see that in the top graph here. These are preliminary results being summarized by the USGS here in Tucson. The green line in the top graph shows the percent of a particular plant that is green at a particular date. And what you can see, this encompasses parts of 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013, I guess the whole year through. And you can see very distinct peaks in the winter and then again in the summer. And we have what we call bimodal precipitation pattern here, where we have a very distinct wet winter, which starts in approximately November or December and stretches till about March-ish. Then it gets very hot and dry, and then our monsoons kick in about early July and can extend through September. And what you can see is that the plants are responding very readily to those cycles in precipitation. The other thing that the graph on top shows you is that these cycles in greenness is captured pretty well by satellite-based observation platforms also. The red line is what's labeled as MODIS EVI. EVI stands for Extended Vegetation Index, or I'm sorry, Enhanced Vegetation Index. And MODIS is a satellite platform. And those are data that are collected on a bi-weekly basis. I think it's collected every day and then summarized on a bi-weekly basis. And so again, that kind of shows you on a much broader scale what is the pattern in greenness. Again, the EVI is a measure of greenness, and what you'll see is that we see the exact same pattern in greenness fluctuating up and down over the course of the year, and that it matches quite well with what was observed on the ground from the bufflegrass patches. And so what we can infer from that is probably the greenness that we're seeing from satellite is a function of what bufflegrass is doing on the ground. So on the bottom graph, what the researchers did was take the percent greenness that was collected by the Nature's Notebook observers and then look to see if there was any patterns with the precipitation that we're seeing over the course of the year. That's what the blue line is in the bottom graph. And what we see is also a pretty clear pattern there, where there's a response in the greenness that's lagged by just a couple of weeks following pulses of precipitation. And so when we collect data like this, then it's possible to construct predictive models where we can then be able to say, all right, well, if it rains this much amount, we might expect a pulse in the greenness of the bufflegrass in this much time, a week or two afterward. And so and that's very important to know, because then if we have a pulse in precipitation, if we have a big rainfall event, then that might motivate managers to get their teams up and ready to go treat in a matter of weeks. So that project is carrying on, and we are continuing to collect data and improve those models, and the researchers here hopefully will be sharing those results shortly with land managers in the region to improve those treatment options.
I did have one question on your previous graph. Can you explain the x-axis?
Oh, the x, sure. I'm sorry, that's time. The 10, 11, 12, or 13 refers to the year, and then the other number is probably the 2-week cycle. I bet, yeah, I'm sorry. I took this slide directly from the researchers, and I didn't think about it. I think what that is MODIS, I believe, is summarized on a 2-week window, and I think what that's referring to is which 2-week period are we at in the year, which is why it goes up to about 22 or 23 by the end of December. And so, yeah. And so when you look at a block that's an entire year, it starts basically at 0 and goes up to about 24, which would be half of 52, right? I mean, my brain just forgot how many weeks there are in a year. Okay, so shifting gears again, I thought I would also walk you through a project called Pop Clock, which is, you can ignore the symbols on this map right now, but basically just to kind of orient you to where it's happening in the country. This is a project that's taking place here in the US and also in Canada, across Canada as well. It's reflecting the distribution of 2 species of populus, or poplars. In this project, we are partnering with researchers from the Center for Environmental Science out of the University of Maryland, as well as other phenology projects called Project Budburst and Plant Watch out of Canada. And in this project, the researchers have recognized, actually many researchers in the field of phenology have recognized that a particular plant's phenology, meaning when it does what it does, putting on leaves or flowering or dropping its leaves, can be locally adapted. So if you were to take a plant from one part of its distribution and move it way across the country to another part of its distribution, those 2 individuals, the transplant and the one that hadn't been moved, might actually exhibit very different timing of those events, like leaf out or flowering, based on the fact that plants can become locally adapted to their environment. And when you're looking at a big distribution, something that covers the entire country, you can have very different conditions, environmental conditions, that can lead to those plants locally adapting to them. And so what these researchers, the Pop Clock researchers, have proposed is that plants in one part of its distribution may be better suited for the conditions that we're going to see under climate change than in another part of the distribution. And so they would like to, they've set out to try and evaluate that for 2 species of poplars, which have very big, broad distributions. And what they're doing is genetically sampling the plants from the different parts of the distributions, and then also looking at the phenology using remotely sensed data, so again, from satellites. Again, you can ignore the circles and the triangles from these maps, but these are the 2 species that are under investigation for this study, Populus balsamifera, which is balsam poplar, and Populus tremuloides, which is aspen, trembling aspen. Quaking, thank you. And what they've partnered up with us to do is to engage observers in tracking the phenology of these 2 species across their distributions, so that they can then use those observations specifically of when the plants are putting on their leaves and dropping their leaves to compare to data that they've collected from satellites. And so what I mean by that is kind of depicted in this map. This was from, I believe, 2014. And again, using the MODIS satellite, the researchers from the University of Maryland estimated when plants put on their leaves. That's what the onset DOY refers to. DOI refers to day of year, and onset means when did the pixels that are part of this image appear to look like they went from not green to green. And I apologize for not putting a little doing a better job with their legend. The red refers to approximately day 60, which would be, let's see, about March 3rd-ish, and then all the way up in the very, very north parts of the image, we're looking at day 160, which would be more like, let me see, mid-May-ish, I guess. And so what they were looking to do then is have observations specifically for those two species using Nature's Notebook or the other phenology observation programs to verify whether what they calculated from this image was actually what was happening on the ground, especially for those species of poplar. And this project's been going on for a couple of years now. I think we have 3 years of data now. And what the researchers did just a few months ago was actually try to compare the data that they got from the satellites here to the observations that were submitted through Nature's Notebook. So basically, what was the day of year that Nature's Notebook participants reported for first seeing bud burst or leaf out for these species, and how does that compare to what they saw from the satellites? And what their original comparison is in the upper left-hand panel of this graph. What we're looking at here, we have four plots that all read the same. Across the x-axis, we have the day of year that was reported by the observers. And then on the y-axis, you have the day of year for onset, for greenness, that was calculated from the satellite. If they matched up, if the observers reported exactly what the satellite reported, then there would be a perfect fit, and all of the dots would be on a line. If you have a situation like this, that means there's a really, really poor fit. There was not good agreement at all. And one of the ways that you can estimate how well that line fits those points is through something called an R-squared. That's an estimate of how much of the variance is captured in the equation, and this is a very, very poor fit. And so what they realized pretty quickly was that they needed to start using some rules to filter out data points that maybe weren't appropriate for this analysis. So this was using all of the reports from Nature's Notebook for the two species of poplar, and all of the associated values coming in from the MODIS, from the satellite. What they did for the first rule here was they filtered out observations that weren't actually suitable. And so, for example, what they did here was if they had observations for leaf out, say in October, they just said, no, that doesn't make sense. We're sure that's not what's happening in the temperate part of the country, so we'll just truncate, things like that. And when they cut out those inappropriate responses or answers, then their R-squared did improve and their line of fit improved a bit, so that was good. And then they also applied a second rule, and what they did here was they constrained their data further, where they said, well, okay, we're going to be picky. We're not going to include every time somebody first reported leaves for their plant. We're only going to count the observations where they said no 10 days before they said yes. So if somebody said no on March 1st, but they hadn't made any previous observation for the whole year, then we don't really know, did the leaf out really happen on March 1st, or did it happen on February 1st, or did it happen on February 15th? It's just, all we know is that's the first time that they reported a yes. When we apply Rule 2, we say, we're only going to count that March 1st as a yes, as a valid data point, if that observer for the same tree reported a no sometime in the previous 10 days. And when they applied that rule and further constrained their data set, that improved their fit even further. Their R-squared is now up to 0.35. And then they applied one more rule, which tightened it up even more, where they recognized, okay, well, maybe it's not all, the lack of fit isn't all a function of the observers not doing a great job. Maybe it's our fault too. And what they realized here was, what they had done was taken the location that an observer was reporting from in Nature's Notebook and taken the MODIS pixel that lined up with that perfectly. But what they realized was not always was that MODIS pixel a great representation of balsam poplar. It may indeed be the case that there was a balsam or a trembling aspen at that point, but MODIS pixels are 250 meters on a side, so they're actually averaging a very large piece of land, and if there's no other poplars in there, say it's a forest of a whole bunch of other things, or it's a big field of corn or something, then the phenology that could be calculated from that satellite data could be a very poor representative. And so the observer might be right and the satellite might be wrong. So the way that they came up with improving that was to take, to move the MODIS pixel to a neighboring stand of poplars that seemed better representative, so that they were comparing apples to apples now as best as possible. And when they did that, then their fit got even better, and their R-squared went up to almost 0.6, which was really surprising and very encouraging. And so these researchers now have presented this at a scientific conference earlier in the year and are working on drafting it in the form of a scientific manuscript. So we're anxiously awaiting that because it's a really good demonstration of how the data collected through Nature's Notebook can be really valuable and used in a very applied, practical manner. And so as those products come forth, we'll be certain to share those with you. Okay, I'm going to shift gears to one more management type of example here. And in this case, I thought I would talk a bit about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because this agency has done a really fantastic job with embracing phenology and recognizing the value of these data. Driven in part by the strategic plan that they put out a couple of years ago for responding to climate change. Right in this plan, they stated they recognize that phenology is changing rapidly, and as the timing of life cycle events in plants and animals is changing, that can have major impacts on things like species distributions, so where species are found, abundance, how many of them there are. Some species we may see major declines in numbers, and others may just proliferate like crazy as a function of these shifts in phenology. Interactions, we may no longer have pollinators present when their food sources are available, and we definitely are seeing some of those kinds of changes occurring around the globe, and lots more. And we don't even know what the trickle-down effects through ecosystems of these changes might be. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service has recognized that monitoring this kind of stuff closely can have a lot of value for informing adaptive refuge management. And there are a variety of refuges across the country that already are busy tracking phenology of plants or animals through one system or another. Several of them are using Nature's Notebook. And I thought I would just briefly talk about the one in New Mexico, the Valle de Oro Refuge, because this one's got a really great example. Has many examples actually of how phenology data and information are being collected and used in an applied way. This particular refuge was established just a few years ago in 2012, and it is the first urban wildlife refuge in the western states. And it is a really cool place to track a lot of different bird species. It's really valued for things like sandhill crane migration. It's also been recognized recently as a great place to see American kestrel, cliff swallows, and a whole bunch of other really cool bird species. This particular refuge right now is actually a working alfalfa farm, but there are plans in the near future to restore that back to mesquite bosque, or I'm sorry, cottonwood bosque, right, and other grasslands and more native habitats that be more appropriate for the bird species and other plant species of the region. One of the problems that they're facing here is that there's a problem with an invasive elm species called Siberian elm. And so the managers want to be very aware of when this particular species disperses its seeds, because they want to avoid exacerbating that problem when they're tilling the fields to try and restore things back to what they would like to have be there. And what they really want to do is try to maximize the dispersal of the native cottonwood species. And so this is just a classic case or situation where having information on when the timing of those two things happen can really lead to a better decision about when to time those activities. And so in just the past couple of years, the Refuge has engaged local volunteers in tracking the phenology of these two tree species, and has done a marvelous job at documenting when would and would not be a good time to till those fields to encourage the distribution of the cottonwood species and minimize the distribution of the Siberian elm. what's been documented is that about mid-March is when the elm is flowering and fruiting. So that's definitely a time that we would not want to be turning the soil over. But if we wait about a month, mid-April is when the cottonwood, which is the species we want, is doing its thing. And that would be a much better time to be out there tilling the fields. So this kind of information is just extremely practical and will be looked upon favorably and really appreciated when it's time to time those restoration activities. Okay, good. We're doing good on time because my next plan is to walk us through a couple of the recent peer-reviewed publications that have come out of the scientific literature. These are kind of different. In many of the previous examples, we, the National Phenology Network, National Coordinating Staff, have worked closely with those different researchers or partners to try and help engage volunteers in collecting those data. And we've been heavily involved in not only helping engage volunteers and share resources for how to use Nature's Notebook, but then also in communicating the results back too. But there are also, there's a growing number of researchers out there that have been accessing the data and utilizing it for scientific discovery. And in many cases, we aren't even aware that this is happening. All the data are freely available. We're constantly improving the ways in which you can access the data and the data products that are being made available. That's a big area of emphasis right now for us. But even in this relatively early phase of having data available, researchers are regularly downloading it, using it, making discoveries, publishing on it in high-level, top-notch journals, and then we just happen to find out, and we're very delighted to see that. And so that's a couple of those examples are what I would like to share with you now. So shifting the focus, again, there's been a whole lot of excitement about especially leaf phenology, and I think part of that is because that's what you can see much more readily from satellites rather than flowers. And the plant data are more prevalent in our database than the animal data. However, we're seeing growth in interest in all of these different fields. Okay, so to talk about this first paper, I just want to give you a little bit of background on kind of the basic thinking about what prompts plants to do stuff in the spring. In temperate environments, and I definitely want to preface this with temperate because this is not necessarily the case in systems that are not temperature limited. But in most of the country where we have a nice cold winter, followed by a nice warm spring and then summer and your traditional 4 seasons, generally it is understood that many plants, not all, but many plants are triggered to put on their leaves in the spring, at least in part by an accumulation of warmth. And that can be measured as accumulated heat. It can be called growing degree days or growing degree hours. There's a lot of different ways to calculate this and to quantify it. But basically what it is if you put time, starting at the beginning of the year, generally how this is calculated, on the x-axis, and the accumulated heat on the y-axis, you generally get something that in a very, very perfect world would look something like this logistic curve here, where in the first few days of the year, you're not really seeing a whole lot of warmth. How this is calculated is it's temperature over a particular base temperature. And that could be 0 degrees, that could be 10 degrees, it could be 5, it could be 50. But what you're looking for is any temperature that occurs above that particular threshold. And if we're calculating it as days, then if on January 1st, if your base temperature was say 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and on January 1st you never got above 0, then you wouldn't accumulate a growing degree day. However, if on January 2nd you did, then you count that as 1. And then if you keep going, you keep counting that, and then you're accumulating that heat over time. And so if at any point you don't cross the threshold, you just don't accumulate. You don't lose it, you just don't accumulate. And so what ends up happening is that you accumulate temperature to a certain point, and for different plants, what triggers them to begin to put on their leaves differs. Species that are likely to leaf out earlier in the season generally seem to have a lower threshold that triggers them than ones that leaf out or flower later in the season. But what will end up happening is that, darn it, I keep doing that. you'll keep accumulating heat until you cross a particular threshold, and that triggers that species to start doing its thing, to either put on its leaves or flowers or whatever it does. And the abiotic environment doesn't really care that that species was triggered. It just keeps on accumulating heat, and then you might eventually cross a threshold where another species in the system is able to begin putting on its leaves. So in this particular paper that just came out in Nature Communications, this group of researchers was very interested to know, well, does it matter whether that accumulated temperature happens during the daytime or the nighttime? Which is kind of an interesting question. The reason that they chose to explore this was twofold. One is that daytime temperature is what's used in the models that are used to predict what's happening with vegetation around the globe and through time. And secondly, what prompted this is that as we've begun to experience global warming or climate change, the nighttime temperatures have shown a greater increase through time than have daytime temperatures. This isn't a marvelous way to depict this, but generally this graph kind of shows that the difference through time in low temperatures is greater than the changes that we've seen in the daytime temperatures. And some researchers have proposed that, well, that might really actually have more bearing on the plants than the daytime temperature, so maybe that's what we should be paying attention to in these climate change models or dynamic global vegetation models. And so these researchers looked at that and diced apart what was happening in daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures, and they used data that was collected through Nature's Notebook and some other databases, vegetation databases as well, to try and answer that question. And what they found for this particular suite of plants that they looked for, specifically in temperate environments, was that the leaf unfolding in the spring was triggered more by daytime temperatures than nighttime temperatures. And so that's a useful thing to know, and it can lead to better predictions of when leaf out might occur, and definitely can help improve those vegetation models for better understanding when things might happen in different parts of the globe through time. A second recent paper that came out looked at a different angle of the same kind of question. So it addresses a major research gap, actually. For many, many, many species, we have no idea, actually, what are the triggers for what will make plants put on their leaves in the spring. We don't really know whether it's temperature. We don't know whether it's a combination of temperature and moisture. We don't know if sometimes day length is invoked as an important feature. So, you know, days must be of a certain length, and then we start accumulating temperature. How much temperature is it? For a lot of crop species, we have this dialed in pretty well, but for many, many native species, we have no idea what it is. And so this group of researchers set out to figure that out for 13 temperate woody species across the US and Europe, and they published this recently in Global Change Biology, which is another really high-profile journal. And they used observations collected and submitted through Nature's Notebook, which is what you're seeing here in the US. This is looking from the North Pole down onto the globe. The black points represent the locations from which they had data, and they also used a bunch of data from Europe to better understand what were the triggers for leaf out for these different 13 species. And a big thing that they looked at in this study was, does it matter to think about how much chill accumulates before we start counting warmth? In the model that the conceptual diagram that I showed you to start this, I said, well, we'll just start counting at January 1st, because that seems like an easy time to start counting accumulated warmth. But what these researchers pointed out was, well, maybe it actually matters to know whether it got cold enough in the winter before we start counting those warmth units. And so that's what they endeavored to evaluate here for these different species. And what they documented was, indeed, how much chill is accumulated really does matter. What the line of thinking here is, and this definitely seems to be borne out by data, is that if plants are used to a nice cold winter, then they need to have a certain exposure to cold temperatures before they start counting those warmth units. And in a warmer world, if our winters are not as cold, then, and they need a particular exposure to a particular amount of cold, then they may be sitting around waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting throughout the winter and even into the spring to accumulate enough chill before they start paying attention to the warmth. And that actually can lead to a delay in when they start putting on their leaves. And this has been documented already in the southeast part of the country. It's been called the warming hole for that very reason. The plants don't seem to be responding to the increasing temperatures the way the rest of the country are, and it's believed that that could be in part due to the fact that they aren't receiving enough chill anymore. What the researchers in this particular study documented that was over the period that they analyzed from 1980 to 2013, the average temperatures increased on average at all those different locations approximately almost 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they saw too was the plants that they were evaluating actually seemed to have an increased need for warmth units to to trigger their leaves going out too. And so that increased need for heat was a function of the fact that they weren't being exposed to the same amount of chill in the winter that they had been used to receiving. And so again, this really matters. This is important to know because those warmer winters could end up delaying the leaf out in the spring. Interestingly, in this particular study, it was complicated by the fact that you've probably heard us and others say, oh, basically the story is we're having warmer temperatures in the spring, and so that's leading to things leafing out or flowering earlier in the spring because the plants are being triggered by that warm temperature. That advancement, though, appears to be getting counteracted by the fact that if those plants aren't receiving enough chill, then that's serving to delay them. So it's becoming a more complicated story than we initially understood. And again, this is only just for temperate environments. And we're not considering water-limited systems, deserts, places that don't have a winter, like the tropics, or all the other parts of the globe that have even more complicated phenological stories. So if you're interested in hearing more about this particular example, Erin very recently drafted up something we call a publication summary. And you can find these on our website. If you go to the Nature's Notebook homepage, under the More Ways to Connect drop-down menu, there's this link for highlighted publications. And we have a number of those now there where we've taken publications like this recent one in Global Change Biology and tried to summarize it in about a page-long summary, and that kind of walks you through what did the researchers do, why did they do it, what did they learn, and what's special about this. And we definitely put emphasis on studies that use Nature's Notebook data with the intent that if you're interested in seeing how your data are used, then you can see this. And also, if you have groups of individuals that you're communicating, say volunteers, that you want to show them how the data are being used, that this can help communicate that, hopefully, in a fairly straightforward manner. Okay, I thought I'd talk you through one more scientific example here fairly quickly. This one is near and dear to our hearts in particular, so I thought I would share it with you. And also, if any of you track a common or cloned lilac, you may have seen a couple of messages on the subject of spring casting from me earlier this year. What the story is with spring casting is for the lilacs and honeysuckles have been monitored actually over the U.S. for decades, well before the USA-NPN was established. And those data have been incredibly valuable in helping to document how plants are responding to increasing temperatures and just changing environmental conditions. And you may know of a fellow named Mark Schwartz, who's a distinguished professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And he, using these data, developed some models similar to the accumulated temperature models that I explained earlier, called the spring indices. And they basically are based on their models that look at the accumulation of temperature in the spring. They used to use the chill accumulated in the winter. They've since removed that chill requirement, and they just look at the accumulation of heat in the spring. And then that can be used to predict basically the onset of spring. It's based on lilacs and honeysuckles, but it's just kind of this aggregated index for generally when spring is expected to occur. And so what we did this past year was model that on the fly using real-time weather data. And so using gridded climate data that was coming in on every few days, a researcher by the name of Toby Alt at Cornell University ran the spring index model, and every week we updated a map like this on our website that showed where we thought we'd crossed into spring. And what we did also was intersect this map with every location where we have folks observing cloned or common lilacs and sent them emails saying, hey, we think your lilac just leafed out. Based on our model, it looks like your lilac just leafed out. Could you please go check and give us your, tell us if that happened? And this is a little depiction of some reports from about midway through the season where we took the predictions for when spring was occurring and then the reports from the lilacs and intersected that to see how well the model was actually doing. And I definitely am planning on doing this kind of evaluation now that we've gotten through spring. We've been held up by some technical issues, but we'll definitely be evaluating that and sharing that back with everybody to report on how well this worked and to also get opinions from observers as to whether they appreciated receiving those kind of messages too. This is also really valuable because this start of spring model has been selected by the US Global Change Research Program as an indicator, one of their 14 new indicators for how things are changing on the planet. This is called the Start of Spring indicator, and what this graph shows, you can go to that website, which is globalchange.gov, and learn more about those indicators. It looks at things like sea ice extent and freezing temperatures and things like that. And what it shows is how the start of spring has really varied through time since the beginning of the 20th century, and that what you'll see in particular is that it's especially showing a trend toward earlier in more recent decades, and 2012 was the earliest on record. And so we'll be continuing. The data that we're collecting continues to help validate the model predictions that are used in this indicator. So that's a very applied way that your data are being used. Okay, and just as a final thank you, I will show you, because I always love to walk you through how we're doing for this year. I have a couple of summary statistics that report on how we're doing so far this year. This graph here is not titled. This is the total number of records coming into Nature's Notebook from 2009, our very first year, all the way up through 2015. And it's a few weeks out of date, but basically this is also a series of cumulative graphs that shows the rate of data being submitted. And what we can see is that in every year we've shown more rapid accumulation of records. This year is no exception, and we're well on our way, hopefully, to meet our goal this year of 1.5 million records submitted to Nature's Notebook. I believe this is up now to 48% as of this morning. I took this screen capture a day or two ago. This is a little tracker that we have on the Nature's Notebook homepage that I love to check just about every day, and I invite you to do the same. It reflects our progress toward that goal of 1.5 million observation records. And it's just so exciting to see that progress, because I know that it means that that people are excited about doing this, and that the data are being collected that can then be used for all these different kinds of applications. One other thing that I will just show you a real quick peek of is where the data are coming from. I believe this is the number of reporting sites by state, and this is a screen capture that is from our brand new, just launched today, data visualization tool. I don't think it's functional right now, because right before this webinar, our IT coordinator discovered that he had a little bug in a piece of code that he had to run last night, and so it's not live, but it might be live by the time this webinar is done. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can find it on the USA-NPN.org. Look under the Get Data tab, and it's the phenology visualization tool. And that tool enables you to explore all sorts of really wonderful spatial and temporal patterns in data that's housed in Nature's Notebook. And rather than telling you more about that, I will invite you to check out the webinar that Lee, the IT coordinator, and some others who have been involved in the development of this tool will be giving on July 14th, where they will walk you through that kind of stuff. One of the really, really cool things that this tool does that our previous tools did not is that it enables you to look at the phenology of species at locations and abiotic data collected from DayMet at those locations too. So you can look and see whether there are patterns in, say, leaf out and accumulated temperature, or leaf out or and precipitation in the previous season, or day length, or elevation or latitude. It's really quite clever. So with that, I will stop talking and leave a few minutes if there are any questions. I'd be happy to try and answer them.
We don't have any questions in yet, but we'll give it a couple minutes in case you are typing now. Just a reminder, we are going to be posting the recording for this webinar as well as the slides online later today, and that link will be coming your way tomorrow in the follow-up email. We also have a survey that will start when you leave the webinar, and so you can answer that, or you can answer it. It'll also come in the follow-up email tomorrow.
And again, I thank you too very much for taking the time to join us today. I know summertime is a busy time for folks, and there's a lot going on, but it was a delight to be able to put this together and communicate these results and applications back to you all. It's still baffling, just mind-boggling to me how much there is to talk about now. it's so exciting. Okay, well, if other questions come to mind, feel free to email me. This is my email at on the website here, or I'm sorry, on the slide here, and also my Twitter. What's that called? A handle, I guess. My Twitter name, whatever. I'd be happy to communicate with you. I'd love to hear anything you have to share. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye.